90,000 hours. That's your life. Most people never think about it. Right now, somewhere today, you're going to stand at a red light and watch the number count down. You're going to stand in a checkout line behind someone paying an exact change. You're going to stare at a spinning wheel on a screen, waiting for something to load that should already be there. You don't think twice about any of it. Waiting feels like weather, just a condition of being alive, something you accept the same way you accept gravity. But start adding it up. Traffic, checkout lines, customer service holds, waiting rooms, airport security, buffering videos, the 2 minutes you stand in front of a microwave watching numbers count down that you could just as easily ignore. Combining transportation studies, consumer surveys, workplace research, and estimates of everyday delays, that's roughly where the number comes from. That's not a typo, and it's not a scare headline exaggeration. That's more than 10 straight years, 10 full years if you live them back to back, with no sleep, no meals, no anything else, spent standing still, doing nothing, on somebody else's schedule. Here's what doesn't fit. For nearly the entire span of time humans have existed on this planet, this specific experience, standing motionless, watching a clock you don't control, waiting for permission to move forward, didn't exist. Not because life moved faster back then, because waiting in the way we experience it today had to be invented. Somebody had to build the conditions that make it possible. So what did humans do for the 300,000 years before there was a line to stand in? And why does modern waiting, even short, trivial waiting, feel so disproportionately awful compared to any delay your ancestors ever dealt with? The answer isn't in traffic engineering, or in customer service scripts, or in your phone's loading spinner. It starts somewhere much older, in the moment a society first decided that some people get to control when other people are allowed to move. And once you see that moment clearly, you can't unsee it. Every red light, every hold music loop, every progress bar, they're not random friction. They're the visible present-day residue of a decision made thousands of years ago about who gets to control time itself. The average person spends around 90,000 hours waiting during their lifetime. That's over 10 years of continuous time. But waiting didn't always consume our lives this way. So how did we get here? Start with the deepest baseline available. In 1982, anthropologist James Woodburn published research describing what he called immediate return societies, hunting and gathering groups whose entire relationship with resources operated on the same day the resource was acquired. You find food, you eat it or share it that day. No storage, no schedule, no institution standing between the effort and the reward. Richard Lee, an anthropologist who lived among and studied the Juhuansi people of the Kalahari during the mid-1960s, produced data that quietly demolished a long-standing assumption about how brutal early human life had to be. His fieldwork suggested adults spent something like 15 to 20 hours a week on subsistence activity total, hunting, gathering, anything directly tied to survival. The rest of the time was unstructured, rest, conversation, tool repair, nothing resembling a shift, an appointment, or a number ticket. Anthropologist Marshall Salins later used data like this to build his famous 1968 argument for the original affluent society, the idea that hunter-gatherers weren't living in constant desperate scarcity, as 19th and early 20th century thinkers assumed, but in a kind of practical abundance, precisely because their economy didn't require storing, guarding, or rationing anything. There is no ethnographic record of a forager standing at a counter with a numbered ticket waiting to be called. If the food wasn't there yet, you didn't wait for it the way you wait for a bus. You moved toward where it might be, you tried something else, or you didn't eat until later. Delay existed. Nature doesn't guarantee anything on schedule. But waiting, specifically, the structured, someone else decides when you move version you live inside every day, simply had no mechanism to exist yet. This wasn't a lucky cultural quirk. It's a direct structural consequence of immediate return economics. When nothing is stored, nothing needs to be guarded, rationed, or distributed on a timetable. There's no middleman standing between you and the resource, which means there's no middleman able to make you stand still and wait for his permission. But the moment any group starts storing surplus, grain, salted meat, anything that survives past today, the entire structure flips. Now, someone has to decide who gets access to the stockpile and when and how much. The instant a society invents storage, it almost as a byproduct invents the first waiting line in human history. Fast forward to ancient Rome and you can watch institutionalized waiting emerge in the historical record almost in real time. The Roman state ran a public grain distribution program called the annona, a system that, at its height under Augustus, provided subsidized or free grain to somewhere around 200,000 Roman citizens on a fixed monthly cycle. 200,000 people, a handful of distribution points, a schedule set entirely by the state's calendar, with zero relationship to any individual citizen's actual hunger that day. Picture the scene historians describe. A citizen shows up on distribution day, holding a token, and joins a crowd stretching for city blocks, packed shoulder to shoulder in the heat, waiting for his section to be called forward. A number that has nothing to do with how hungry he is, and everything to do with how the bureaucracy chose to sequence the line. As far as the historical and archaeological record shows, this is one of the earliest large-scale documented experiences you'd recognize instantly. Standing in a crowd, access to a basic resource fully mediated by an institution's timetable instead of your own need. Not a metaphorical queue, an actual, physical, hours-long line enforced by armed officials over grain. Here's the detail most people miss. Agriculture didn't just produce a food surplus, it produced the first bureaucracies capable of managing that surplus. And bureaucracy's first cultural export wasn't the grain itself, it was the queue required to access it. You call this getting your number called at the DMV or the deli counter. A Roman citizen in 20 BC would have recognized the exact feeling of it within seconds. The same shuffling, the same low-grade resentment, the same math in your head about whether it's worth leaving and coming back later. Historical accounts also note that these distributions required organized crowd control, officials and at times soldiers present specifically to manage the press of people and prevent the line from collapsing into a crush. That detail matters. The moment a society builds a queue large enough to need enforcement just to keep people standing in it correctly, waiting has stopped being a side effect of scarcity and become a managed system in its own right, one with rules, order, and consequences for stepping out of line in every sense of the phrase. Skip forward 2,000 years to 1985 Harvard Business School. Consultant and researcher David Maister published an essay called The Psychology of Waiting Lines that became foundational to how airports, banks, and theme parks design queues to this day. His central insight: the actual clock time you spend waiting matters far less than the psychological experience layered on top of it. Unoccupied time feels longer than occupied time. Uncertain waits feel longer than waits with a visible, known endpoint. Waits that feel unfair, someone cutting the line, or an unexplained holdup feel longer than equitable ones, even measured at the exact same duration on a stopwatch. Around this same era, MIT professor Richard Larson built much of his academic career studying queues so exhaustively that colleagues nicknamed him Dr. Q. His research on what he called the psychology of queuing formalized something airport operators had already stumbled onto by accident years earlier. There's a case widely told in operations research and design circles involving Houston Intercontinental Airport. Passengers kept filing complaints about excessively long waits at baggage claim. The actual measured wait time was already fairly short by industry standards. The complaints kept coming regardless. The eventual fix wasn't a faster conveyor system. It was moving the arrival gates significantly farther from the baggage claim area, so passengers spent more time moving and dramatically less time standing motionless, staring at an empty carousel. By most accounts, complaints dropped close to zero. The actual total time, gate to bag in hand, barely changed. What changed was how much of that time was spent moving versus standing still,
doing nothing, watching a clock you don't control. That's the pivot most operations research keeps circling back to. The delay itself was rarely the real problem. The feeling of powerless stillness was the problem. Once engineers and psychologists understood that distinction, an entire industry stopped trying to eliminate waiting and started trying to disguise it instead. Every hold music playlist, every looping "your call is important to us" message, every deliberately serpentine cue line at a theme park, built specifically to keep you turning corners and passing landmarks instead of staring down one long, demoralizing straight stretch. All of it descends directly from this same mid-century discovery. You were never simply waiting in most of these systems. You were being actively, invisibly managed.
Now, a fair objection deserves airtime here. Maybe none of this is really about psychology at all. Maybe modern life just contains vastly more contact points where delay can occur. More services, more institutions, more screens. So naturally, more total waiting shows up in a modern life than in a forager's day. Hunger, but not the particular, distinctly modern flavor of standing motionless, watched by no one in particular, controlled entirely by an institution's clock, doing nothing while your own finite time visibly drains away in front of you. That specific feeling, monitored, powerless stillness with no ability to act your way out of it, required someone to first build a system capable of producing it, and then centuries later to study exactly how to make that system feel a little more tolerable without ever actually making it faster. The number of possible waiting triggers went up over time, but so deliberately did the engineering of the discomfort layered onto each one. There's also a subtler point worth making. If modern waiting were purely a matter of more contact points and nothing else, you'd expect the discomfort to scale evenly with how long the wait actually lasts. It doesn't. A short wait with no visible progress and no clear cause, a stalled elevator with a blank floor indicator, a spinning icon with no percentage, routinely gets rated by people as more frustrating than an objectively longer wait where the cause and endpoint are both visible. Duration alone can't explain that gap. Only the specific psychological conditions layered on top of the duration can. In 2007, researchers Chris Harrison, Brian Amento, Peter Kuznetsov, and Robin Bell, working out of Carnegie Mellon and AT&T Labs, published a study that should unsettle anyone who has ever stared at a progress bar. Their experiments found the exact same underlying wait time attached to different visual progress indicators produced measurably different perceptions of how long that wait actually took. A bar that starts slow and accelerates toward the end reliably felt shorter to participants than one moving at a perfectly constant pace, even when the total elapsed time was identical. A bar with small visible pauses and stutters felt meaningfully worse than one with steady, continuous motion, again at the same average speed. This isn't an obscure academic footnote sitting unused in a journal. This is the literal design language behind nearly every app installer, file upload bar, and "please wait while we process your request" message you interact with on a weekly basis. Somebody, somewhere, specifically chose how your progress bar accelerates and stutters, using research built explicitly to manipulate how long a wait feels, independent of how long it actually is. Now compare that engineered experience to the worst version of waiting most people encounter today, a bare spinning circle with no percentage, no time estimate, no visible endpoint at all. Research on uncertainty in waiting consistently points to this exact format, the unbounded, informationless wait, as the most psychologically punishing version available, because it strips away the one small mercy that even a 2,000-year-old Roman grain line still offered. You could at least see roughly where you stood in it and roughly how much longer it would take. Your phone's blank loading spinner and an ancient breadline are, underneath, completely different surfaces running the identical underlying problem: a person standing still, waiting for a system they don't control to decide when they're finally allowed to move again. By the time you reach modern theme parks, the disguise gets almost artistic.
Walt Disney Engineering, the division responsible for designing every ride and queue at Disney's parks, has spent decades refining what designers openly call queue theming, turning the literal waiting line into a themed environment with its own story, props, sound design, and sightlines, specifically so guests experience the wait as part of the entertainment rather than a delay before it. Look at the queue for something like The Haunted Mansion, or more recently, Star Wars Rise of Resistance, and you'll find guests walking through elaborately detailed sets, a crashed ship, a first-order interrogation room, often not realizing they've been in line for 15 or 20 minutes because the environment gave their attention somewhere to go besides the clock. This is Meister's occupied time feels shorter principle, built at theme park budget and scale. Disney pushed the concept further with virtual queuing systems, letting guests reserve a place in line digitally and walk away, freed from standing in one physical spot at all. The wait didn't disappear, the requirement to stand motionless while doing it did, which, according to the same body of research, is often the part guests were reacting to most strongly in the first place. Here's the detail worth sitting with. None of this made anything faster. A century of queue psychology research from Meister's essay to Disney's billion-dollar theming budgets has one shared, almost embarrassing conclusion. Nobody figured out how to make people wait less. They figured out, with increasing sophistication, how to make people mind it less, while the underlying hours kept accumulating exactly the same. So where does a figure like 90,000 hours actually come from? Not from one tidy study, but from stacking independently measured categories on top of each other. Transportation analytics firm INRIX has published its global traffic scorecard for close to 2 decades. In 2019, the average American driver lost roughly 99 hours to congestion alone. Drivers in the most congested cities, like New York, still lose over 100 hours a year today. Stack that across a driving lifetime, even conservatively, and you're already past 2,500 hours spent stationary in traffic before a single checkout line is added. Consumer surveys across the US and UK consistently find people lose another 30 to 45 minutes a day to smaller waits, checkout lines, transit, waiting rooms, holds with customer service. Across 65 adult years, even the low end of that range adds up to over 13,000 hours. Add digital waits, loading screens, buffering, software updates, each tiny alone, constant across a life lived on screens. Layer these independently documented categories across a full adult lifetime, and estimates converge conservatively somewhere north of 90,000 hours, more than 10 years spent on systems that were never built around your body's patience. They were built around what that patience could be made to tolerate. So what if the 90,000 hours you'll spend waiting over a lifetime isn't really a story about wasted time at all? What if it's a story about a feeling your nervous system was never built to sit inside? The specific, modern experience of being stationary while a system you don't control decides your next move. And every institution since the first grain silo has simply been finding new, more sophisticated ways to make that feeling survivable without ever actually shrinking it. Waiting isn't an inconvenience bolted onto modern life by accident. It's the oldest, quietest tax civilization ever invented. Every generation since has just been handed a slightly more polished version of the same bill, dressed up in hold music and progress bars instead of Roman grain tokens. The next red light you sit at, the next spinner you watch turn on a screen, the next hold music loop you half listen to while pretending to do something else, none of it is really about the 10 or 20 seconds directly in front of you. It's about 90,000 hours, scattered across one single life, spent standing still for systems that were never designed around your body could comfortably bear, only around exactly how much of that patience they could quietly take before you finally noticed it. Your ancestors never once stood in that line. You've usually done it twice before breakfast. They spent their days moving toward what they needed, on terms mostly their own. You spent a decade of your one life standing perfectly still, waiting for permission that was never really about you. It was about how efficiently someone else could process the crowd you happened to be standing in. 90,000 hours, paid in full, mostly without ever noticing the receipt.